What is up, everybody? This is Jay, aka MultimediaJay, and what's old in gaming is new again. Welcome to Jay's Atari Intermission. You know, folks, there's an old saying, life. Keep on living it. And if you live long enough, you get to see stuff like this happen. So I've said many times that gaming for me began with the ill-fated Atari 7800. A generation later, and the company that owns the rights to the Atari stuff is now making a brand new 7800, the Atari 7800 Plus. And for the longest time, I was like, a little too expensive, little too expensive, little too expensive. Until I saw this. Woot.com. Apparently, it's one of those flash sale things, kind of like how Cowboom.com used to be one for Best Buy. I'm still laughing at that name all these years later. But Woot.com had a flash sale on the Atari 7800, 7800 Plus, for $80, which places it at roughly the same price as what I got the Retro Duo for all those years ago. Not so sure about the $129.99 for a retro box, but under $100 would definitely be a sweet spot for me to get back into collecting for Atari. Now, I gotta say, when it comes to Atari stuff, though, collecting for Atari in the 2020s is a fool's errand. There are so many emulation options, from Stella to Pro System to, I think, Bup System is the latest 7800 emulator, and even the Atari 50 collection, which is an awesome game to get on Steam, by the way. There are just so many better ways through emulation nowadays than going back to a physical Atari box. But for someone like me, who is like, what is old is new again, this was a no-brainer. I had to get this ASAP just to check it off the bucket list. As a side effect of this retro palooza from Atari here, what's also worth noting is that Atari Interactive, since they own the IPs to all the hardware and stuff, they basically have been making new versions of the controllers. And these are wireless, of course, but these have dongles that hook them up to the original hardware and to USB for computers. So you can use these for emulators and Atari 50, Atari Vault, all the Atari compilations out there that are already there. You can finally play them with real controllers. So even if you don't get a box like I did to put cartridges in, there's still plenty of ways you can benefit from this Atari renaissance, so to speak, with all this stuff that's been going on. So I've told this story numerous times now, but gaming for me began with the Atari 7800 as my first console, or the ill-fated Atari 7800 as I like to call it. And that was the result of, shortly after we lost my mother when I was very young, I had to go to a sitter's house for the first time, and they had an Atari 2600, or should I say, the original wood grain Atari VCS. And this was an upper middle class family. The sitter that was watching me was a stay-at-home mom, staying at home raising 3 kids. And it was basically a situation where her kids, I became friends with them, and they introduced me to video games. And I thought it was really cool that I could control what was going on the TV. Because I've been watching TV up to that point, but to be able to control what was going on in the screen, no matter how blippy and bloopy it was, that was something cool to me. So I was introduced to Atari. Now, this is late 80s, so after the video game crash. So Atari was very, very quickly moving towards becoming the flea market console that you got if your family didn't have a lot of money. So they got me into Atari because they didn't have Nintendo yet, and I was like, Dad, I want an Atari. And the Atari that you could get was this thing. This is the Atari 7800 US version, and with the horrible, horrible joystick. This thing would hurt your knuckles. It was not ergonomic. It was painful to use after long hours trying to beat your best times in pole position 2. The European one was the one with the gamepad. And I can say, though, although it looks like a Nintendo controller, it is not. It is obviously inspired by the Nintendo and Sega Master System gamepads, but unfortunately, Atari doesn't quite get the formula down as well as Nintendo did. So this isn't exactly what I'd call a standard setter. It also has a little screw-in joystick here, and it's digital. It's not analog. Maybe the PlayStation generation might like it, but I couldn't stand it. But yeah. So this is basically what the 7800 was inspired by. And for those of you who might be new to this stuff, who are thinking, isn't that the Atari answer to the Nintendo controller? Sort of. Look at the size difference, and look at the length difference between the buttons. So those of you that grew up with Nintendo knew that you could use the tip of your thumb to hit one button and the middle of your thumb to hit the other one. And that basically became the standard through SNES, N64, everything since then. But on the 7800 controller, it is a little too far apart for you to do that comfortably. So, not quite. It's obviously inspired by the Sega Master System and the NES, but it's not quite the same. So the thing with Atari nowadays, and the best way that I can describe it, is that the Atari of today is not the same as the Atari of its heyday. In the 70s and 80s, we had Atari Inc. Nowadays, we have Atari Interactive, a subsidiary who owns the Atari IPs and stuff. Infogrames, I think, was the last company that bought them out. I think they might have renamed the whole company since then, because Atari is such a strong brand. But I'd have to go dig around Wikipedia for 2 seconds to do that, and I'm just too anxious to head on over and check out the 7800 Plus I've got sitting in the project area. But you can see where they've made their major steps since the Atari flashback, where people were face palming and stuff like, I want a new Atari. I want something that plays the old games I bought at some flea market 12 years ago. You know, so there were actually people that were modding the Atari flashbacks to support cartridges and add cartridge slots in the early days. But the emulation and the system on a chip didn't really help with that. But now, finally, we have some systems that can actually take cartridges, and because collecting Atari in the 2020s is a fool's errand. I mean, this was the flea market console when I was a kid 30 years ago. With today's world and the way it is, with having to scratch and scrounge for whatever Atari cartridges are still out there that still work, especially the 7800, they've actually started making games again as well. Re-releasing compilations because they own all those rights and stuff. But let's look at Atari cartridges here. Atari 50 is cool. They also have the Atari Reimagined series. It's reimagining some classics from the Atari days. But you actually can see here that there are actually cartridges available, and some of them don't have ESRBs, so some of them are straight up reprints. Some of them don't have ESRB on them, so some of them are straight up re-releases from back in the day. Like, Fatal Run, I never heard of any of these three, because unfortunately the Atari 7800 came and went. There was only a grand total of like 50-something games for it, grand total. So anything new or any homebrews that get converted into official releases nowadays are probably going to finally give the 7800 and Atari in general the respect that it deserved back then. For those of you unfamiliar, the 7800 was supposed to compete with the NES, but it was technologically doomed never to do so, because of some serious technical hiccups like the sound and whatnot that kept it from being a proper competitor to the NES, even though it could play games that reminded you of NES games. Kind of like if you compare NES to Sega Master System and you run into like some of the tech differences here and there between them. But the 7800 Plus is based on a European console, and there's all these bundles they're selling. But they also have wireless. You can use them with computers as well. I wonder when there's going to be a wireless paddle controller set that comes out that'll run the same way. That would be awesome. Then I could finally play Circus Atari and Video Olympics with something besides a computer mouse in Atari 50. Atari 50 is an awesome collection on PC and regular console. But if you have the stuff, why not get the real feel with real hardware, so to speak, and finally give this console the respect that it should have had all those years ago. Of course, there were re-releases of the 2600 that looked kind of like this as well, so it's kind of like 70s Atari versus 80s Atari with all this other stuff. But anyways, yeah, it's cool that this is a thing again, especially in this day and age of games as a service and consoles that are more like computers with all the updates and stuff and internet connectivity. Just have simple gaming again like this is pretty cool. And it's a shot across the bow of Nintendo. I mean, and even Sony. How many of these like classic consoles, were basically like little blippity little emulator boxes that, couldn't handle the original media? Well, Atari's managed to do it. And with the Atari Plus platform, if you have original hardware, these games should work on it. So backward and forward compatibility. Of course, I understand since it's an emulator, there are some games that don't load properly, but of course, you can hook this thing up to your computer and update the firmware nowadays. So, anyways, what's old is new again. I guess, if we're gonna be all retro, I don't think it gets any more retro than Atari. So why don't we go check that thing out over there and actually do a proper unboxing and set that sucker up. Till next time, this is MultimediaJay signing off. Thanks for stopping by.